Good evening, I'm Jim Kirchherr, and this is our 2016 Voters Guide. Now, our thoughts were that most all of you have made up your minds about the big races, president, senator, governor, so we're not going to go very deep into those. But a lot of years you get down on the ballot a bit, and there are those propositions and amendments. And this year in Missouri, there are quite a few on the statewide ballot, and that we will get into, so stay with us. And joining us tonight to talk about and explain what's on this year's ballot are two experienced political reporters from St. Louis Public Radio, Joe Mannis, not your first election, Joe, I think, right?
No.
And Jason Rosenbaum, and they will be helping us make sense of those amendments and propositions. But first, we wanted to take a quick look at the two top statewide office races in Missouri. For U.S. Senate, Republican Roy Blunt is running for his second term. Before that, he served 14 years in the House of Representatives, where he held a leadership position for the Republicans. He's from the Springfield area and is 66 years old. His challenger is Democrat Jason Kander. He's 35 and is finishing his first term as Missouri Secretary of State. Before that, he was a state representative from the Kansas City area, and he was in the Army National Guard and served as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan. For governor, Jay Nixon is term limited out, so Missouri will have a new governor. The Republican candidate is 42-year-old Eric Greitens, who's running for his first elective office. He's a former Navy SEAL who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and is the founder of the veteran service organization The Mission Continues. He was once a Democrat and is from the St. Louis area. Democratic candidate for governor Chris Koster was once a Republican. The 52-year-old St. Louis native has been Missouri's Attorney General for 2 terms. He switched from Republican to Democrat while serving in the state legislature. There are 3 other candidates for governor: a Libertarian, Green, and Independent. So both the governor's race, Senate race, according to the polls, pretty close. But let's talk Senate, because this year, anything that might affect the balance of power in the U.S. Senate is going to be watched closely. We have both Missouri and Illinois with Republican incumbents who are challenged, really challenged this year.
There's about 6 Senate races across the country that will likely determine where the Senate goes, Democratic, or if it stays Republican. And the Illinois one is considered probably that it's definitely going to switch from Republican to Democrat. So everybody's looking at Missouri because a lot of the national people hadn't been paying attention, even though we had for months. And it's a very tight race between Kander and Blunt. Blunt has not gotten as much support as Donald Trump has gotten. There's some Trump people who don't like him for various reasons. But so, and Kander is portraying himself as the new face, the new millennial and what we need.
Well, I think it was a huge mistake for national prognosticators to write Missouri off so quickly. A lot of people thought that Blunt was a safe bet for re-election, but anybody who follows Missouri politics knows that just because Missourians tend to vote Republican for president doesn't mean that they're also going to vote Republican in statewide offices. If that was the case, why was Jay Nixon, a Democrat, elected to 2 terms by double digits? So
what do we see at stake in the Senate? Is it really about the Supreme Court, you think? Is that the biggest issue here?
Part of it. Missouri's one of about 6 races across the country that will likely determine whether the Supreme Court stays Republican or turns Democrat. And the Supreme Court is among the key issues that both sides are using. The social conservatives in particular see the Supreme Court as the way to outlaw abortion, go back on same-sex marriage, and some other things that are very important to them. Naturally, progressives don't want any of that to happen. And if Hillary Clinton happens to be elected president, if she does not have a Democratic Senate.
And that's possible because the American voters have done that fairly often.
She will likely, I mean, the way the Democrats see it, she probably won't be able to do hardly anything. And anything as far as her agenda goes. Now, if Trump wins, of course, that's what he wants. He wants a Republican Senate. So both candidates who are running for president really want a Senate of their party because the Senate will be so important in so many ways, but the Supreme Court in particular.
Let's talk quickly about the governor's race. What do we see at stake? It's an interesting race because we have both candidates who've flipped parties. But what are we really looking at as being significant one to the other?
I think the biggest thing at stake is right to work, which is shorthand that supporters use to describe a policy that would no longer make paying union dues a condition of employment if an entity that union people are in has voted to organize. Eric Greitens will sign right to work. Chris Koster will veto it. And there has never been more on the line from that particular issue just from one race. But I think that this race has really not even been about that. It's become an incredibly nasty personal battle between Greitens and Koster. I think that each side is not only trying to beat them in election, but frankly bury them personally because they detest each other so much.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit about how much money is being spent in Missouri, but maybe we'll save that for the campaign contribution discussion. But I wanted to let you know that if you are still looking for your polling place, and they do change from year to year, you can see your full local ballot as well, get information on St. Louis County judges, all of this at 9net.org/voters for that and other information. Now we're going to run down a couple of the other statewide offices, but I really want to get through these ballot measures tonight. There are quite a few in Missouri this year that you're going to be asked to vote on, yes or no. Constitutional Amendment 1 would continue for 10 years the 0.1% sales tax, which goes for soil and water conservation, state parks, and historic sites. A yes vote keeps that tax in place. Constitutional Amendment 2, this one would establish limits on campaign contributions in Missouri. Amendment 3 is one of the two proposals on the ballot, which would raise the cigarette tax. This one would raise it 60 cents a pack, with the money going to early childhood health and education. But there's more to it than that, including an additional increase that would raise the price of off-brand cigarettes. And then further down the ballot, there's Proposition A, the other cigarette tax proposal. This one would raise the tax 23 cents a pack, with money going for transportation infrastructure. Amendment 4 would prohibit any new state or local sales taxes on services that aren't taxed now, things like haircuts, dry cleaning, healthcare, and home repairs. Voting yes means if a service is not taxed now, it cannot be taxed in the future. Amendment 6. Voting yes on this would give the state legislature power to pass a new voter ID law and require government-issued photo IDs in order to vote in elections. Voters in the city and St. Louis and St. Charles counties will see Proposition S on the ballot, voting yes or no on a property tax levy of 5 cents per $100 assessed valuation. The money would go to support services for seniors. And Illinois residents will be voting on an amendment to the state constitution, the so-called transportation lockbox. It would require all money coming in from transportation-related taxes and fees to be spent only on transportation, things like roads and bridges, rail, airports, and mass transit. It would prevent the state legislature from using transportation money for anything else. So a couple of these amendments on the Missouri ballot, the soil and water conservation, the no additional sales taxes on services, those are pretty much to keep things as they are, if I understand it. Anything else, complications, clarifications needed on these two?
Well, Amendment 4, which is the one which would bar sales taxes on services, that is primarily aimed, I believe, in curbing the effort of some conservatives, particularly wealthy financier Rex Sinquefield, to increase the sales tax and then curb or eliminate Missouri's income tax. So if Amendment 4 passes, the backers think that puts the kibosh on that.
But isn't there a general anti-tax movement as well in this?
I think so. It's preemptive. There really aren't a lot of taxes on services right now, like lawn mowing or babysitting or something like that.
Hairdressing.
Right.
But I think that it's aimed at preventing that from occurring, and we'll see if it passes. There is a little bit of opposition to it, which doesn't always bode well for some of these particular amendments.
And the soil and water conservation tax, that again continues something. It's not specifically saying where or how the money would be spent. There might be some opposition to those issues, but not necessarily to continuing.
There's no organized opposition. There's no major ads running saying don't do this. And part of it's because it's been in place for decades. And about half the money goes to help state parks. So there's general support for it, at least among the rank and file.
So let's move on to Amendment 2, limits on campaign contributions. Currently, Missouri, if I understand it, has no limits.
None.
None. Okay.
Definitely none.
We're a
Zero,
no-limit state.
six.
This would put a cap, $2,600 you could give to a particular candidate, $25,000 to a party, is that right?
Yes.
And again, Missouri's one of the only states. It's as wide open as you can get, right, in terms of campaign contributions right now?
And it is, and I think that it's caused many elections to become very expensive. We have the most expensive governor's race in the country because interest groups and wealthy individuals can donate directly to candidates as opposed to third-party groups. This particular amendment would not place campaign contributions on third-party PACs. It would also not place campaign contributions on municipal or county candidates. And both of those realities has caused some people, even proponents, to worry that crafty politicians are going to use those loopholes basically to raise large amounts of money, either indirectly or directly. But conversely, the proponents say you got to start somewhere.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like Democrat Chris Koster, who actually used to be against campaign finance limits, has kind of been converted because Greitens has gotten some huge ones. About $2 million from a group called Sales for Truth. Nobody really knows who those donors were. And then most of Greitens' general election money is going through the Republican Governors Association, like $17 million. So about 90% of his money. So you don't, all those donors are giving money to that group, which are then giving it to him directly by writing checks. Under this, they wouldn't be able to do that. I mean, they could run independent ads or something, but they couldn't give like that. All the candidates would just be restricted to $2,600 each from a donor. Now, there, as Jason mentioned, there's going to be ways around it. They did it before, but some see this as a way to at least start to put the brakes
Right.
on things.
In the Citizens United case, for example, the argument was this is free speech. So if I've got $1 million, I ought to be able to give it to whomever I want.
Yeah, and one thing I want to emphasize, this does not affect the Senate race or the congressional races. This only affects the state races, so which are, again, no donation limits, where there are federal ones in place, which is why the ads you're seeing in the Senate race are all from third parties and they're directly on TV because they can't give directly to Senate candidates.
And most likely, if this ends up passing and being sustained after a likely court challenge, because there is going to be a court challenge over this, that's probably what Missouri's campaign finance system will resemble, the federal system. It may not actually reduce the amount of money that's being spent on competitive races. It'll just kind of change where the money is going.
Would it be easier to track down for guys like you who want to?
Well, possibly, but as Joe mentioned, we're seeing situations now where huge donations are coming to some of these candidates, and when you do look for the source of information, if they come at all, it's like some nondescript LLC. So the transparency that proponents of no donation limits promised back in 2008, it generally has been the reality, but not always, especially in major situations like this. And I think that this has a good chance of passing, but the bigger question is whether it will survive in court.
Right, right. Would this, if it passes and goes into effect, put Missouri more in line with what other states do?
More or less, yes, it would, and I think that's the aim. But this big loophole is that it doesn't affect local candidates. So there have been some who expect that, depending on who's governor, that there may be pressure on the General Assembly to try to come up with something dealing with the local races. But again, it depends. Greitens does not support this. So if he's elected, he'll probably, I mean, obviously if it passes and he wins, they have to deal with it. But you may not see a speedy General Assembly action as you might see if Koster wins, and only because he's a convert.
Right, right.
I mean, there are no white knights here.
What Joe is talking about is there is a fear that if this goes into effect, a lot of candidates that want to run for state-based offices may run for city council, mayor, county commissioner, raise unlimited amounts of money, and either transfer the money to another race. It's not certain that you can do that yet.
You can't.
Or spend money on independent expenditures.
But again, a lot of people would argue that Missouri needs something, right? And as I say, this would be a place to start.
Well, and you may see what happened in the 1990s, where there was pressure early on to get campaign donation limits. There was actually a proposal. Roy Blunt actually was one of the big proponents. We're talking 92. Then it ended up, there was something that was put on the ballot. The General Assembly acted and put some in place that were in place beginning in 95. But in 94, the voters voted on even stricter limits, and that passed by about 70% of the vote. Then there was a court case that went on for years. I covered the Supreme Court deliberations on that, and that was in 1999. And Jay Nixon, who was then Attorney General, was arguing it. So we could see a case where we could have years of uncertainty even if it passes.
Okay, so you guys ready to talk cigarette taxes and see if you can help us out? There are two cigarette tax measures on the ballot. The bigger increase is Constitutional Amendment 3, with the money going to fund early childhood programs. There's a separate smaller increase, Prop A, that would go to transportation projects. What you see on the ballot for Amendment 3 is short, right? But the amendment here is pretty long. And that's what we're seeing. A lot of people are seeing a lot of things. Well, you need to look deeper into this. It's more than just a cigarette tax and early childhood. Is it, or is this just legislative amendment writing that we still need to look at the very top of this amendment?
Well, there's two tobacco tax proposals, as
Right.
you mentioned, and Amendment 3 has a lot of provisions in it. The bottom line is they tried to please everybody, so some would say the proponents ended up pleasing nobody, because there are provisions in it that are aimed at curbing or at least preventing any of the new money raised from going to any sort of stem cell research. Not that it would be spent there anyway, but that's really gotten Washington University and some of the research groups whipped up. And there's also provision that would allow this money, which is supposed to be for early childhood education and healthcare, to go to private and parochial schools for their programs. And so you've got some public education groups that initially had been with us that have since pulled their endorsement because of this. And also there's the fact that tobacco companies provide most of the money for this. They also provide most of the money for Prop A too, but it's a different group of tobacco companies. But this one is because it's got this extra 67-cent tax that would be on the low-cost cigarettes, and that's because of a complicated fight almost 20 years ago that requires the big tobacco companies to pay a surcharge in Missouri, and the cheap tax and the cheap cigarette companies don't pay it, and so they're trying to correct it, and
So
it's all in this one bill.
Right. So first of all, if you're a cigarette smoker, I mean, we could look at how much it's going to cost for a pack of cigarettes. And the budget pricing under this would kind of go down. The cheaper cigarettes would be as expensive as the major brand of cigarettes.
I think that the biggest problem for Amendment 3 is that the amount that it's increasing the tobacco tax by, which is the lowest in the nation, is much higher than prior tobacco tax increase proposals, which have all failed. And there are a lot of tertiary issues around it, dealing with stem cell research and abortion, and the fact that a major tobacco company is primarily funding Amendment 3 and littler tobacco companies are funding Prop A. But I think the fact of the matter is, and the biggest hill for proponents of Amendment 3 to climb over, is that this is a really large tax increase by comparison to the other ones that have failed. And given that there's so much passionate opposition to this, I'm not sure that they're going to be able to divert from the recent history on this.
Right, the focus here should have been, or I think maybe it was intended to be, on early childhood programs. And I'm seeing support from some early childhood advocates saying the trade-off is good for us. Does this legitimately fund early childhood? Because people are always worried about, well, it's like lottery money. It goes in one door, comes out the other.
Well, there are provisions in it that bar the money from being allocated to something else. And so the backers are saying this is going to protect it. But still, the General Assembly has a way of, if there's dedicated money that's put into something, they find a way to take maybe other money that has been spent on it out. Now, as proponents do mention, there isn't very much spent in Missouri on early childhood education now. So they're like, well, there won't be that much for the General Assembly to try to strip from other sources because it's not spent anyway. But again, they tried to please everybody, and so there's it's unclear if they pleased anybody.
It's a complicated
And
amendment,
90% of their money is coming from the parent company of R.J. Reynolds.
Right. Quick question. What happens if the lower tax and the higher tax pass? Do we know?
It's unclear. There are some who argue that the higher tax would go into effect. There are some who argue that both taxes would go into effect. I think a court would end up deciding the answer to that.
I wanted to move on. Again, this is complicated. And I think overly complicated for what was intended to be. Let's talk about Amendment 6, voter photo ID.
Yes, it's photo ID.
Right.
We already have voter ID.
Right.
But it's photo ID. It requires someone to show up with a government-issued photo ID. If this passes, it doesn't have a lot of the details in it. Most of the details are in a separate piece of legislation that was passed by the General Assembly earlier this year, and they overrode Governor Jay Nixon's veto of it, which lays out what sort of IDs there would be and other procedures. Although that law could be changed. I mean,
This only allows the legislature to pass a law, right? It's not the actual law itself.
Based off a court ruling in the 2000s, they needed a constitutional amendment to actually have the law that Joe mentioned go into effect. And one of the reasons why some Democrats, and I don't think it's a lot of Democrats, but it's still a few, feel that the law that was passed is maybe not as bad as other states is, first of all, it would pay for supporting documents like a birth certificate, although it would be very expensive. It's almost $17 million.
Yeah, and see, they almost have to do that because, frankly, the U.S. federal government would probably come after them if they don't, because you've got lots of people who don't have their birth certificates, and it might cost them $30 or $40 to get it.
The other thing is that if you don't have a government-issued photo ID under this law, you can sign an affidavit saying you are who you are, and you would be able to vote. And it wouldn't even be a provisional ballot, from what I've understood. It would
Correct.
be a regular, non-provisional ballot. So I think that those have softened a little bit of opposition, but I think philosophically, many Democrats absolutely detest the idea of a government-issued photo ID requirement. They feel that it hurts minorities, the elderly, people that are low income, that don't have cars where they would need a driver's license. And so I think that they're trying to fight against this on principle. And there is some money to oppose it, but not a huge amount of money,
Right.
which I think may bode well for the proponents of this particular.
And one of the things, though, the law that it would allow to go into effect, it could be changed. So some of the opponents are like, well, just because the law we've got here isn't so bad, would the General Assembly come back and change it and make it worse? Who knows?
We have, and we want to mention the Transportation Lockbox Amendment in Illinois, which would put transportation fees and lock it into transportation spending. Give me a quick explanation, the difference between an amendment and a proposal, and why we're seeing so many more constitutional amendments as opposed to a simple proposal.
Well, especially in Missouri, when a constitutional amendment is passed, it's impossible for the legislature to change it. The only way to get something out of the Missouri Constitution is to have another statewide vote. We've had instances before where statutory ballot initiatives have been either drastically changed by the General Assembly or erased altogether. Campaign donation limits is one example, and a particular set of regulations on dog breeding is another example.
Right.
So I think that there is a push to put a lot of things in the Constitution, like this campaign donation limit amendment. The problem is if there are problems with these particular proposals, it's really difficult
It's hard
to
to
change
fix.
them.
And the transportation lockbox in Illinois is specifically designed to keep the legislature's hands off that money and using it for other stuff. So it's in the state constitution and it's not in the legislature. So I wanted to do one more thing before we go. We wanted to do a quick wrap up of some of the other statewide races that Missourians will be voting on tomorrow, and we'll have a quick discussion, clarification of that. In the lieutenant governor's race, the Democratic candidate, former U.S. Congressman Russ Carnahan. The Republican is State Senate Majority Whip Mike Parson. There are also Libertarian and Green Party candidates. In the Missouri Secretary of State's race, a couple of candidates with familiar names, both trying for their first elective state office. The Republican, Jay Ashcroft, an attorney and son of former Governor John Ashcroft. And Democrat Robin Smith, the former TV news anchor, along with a Libertarian candidate. The Attorney General's race has Republican Josh Hawley, a lawyer and University of Missouri law professor, and Democrat Teresa Hensley, an attorney who served as Cass County prosecutor. The Missouri State Treasurer's race also has no incumbent. The Democratic candidate is Judy Baker of Columbia, a former state rep, and the Republican, State Senator Eric Schmidt from St. Louis County. Also, Libertarian and Green candidates. And so we have these other statewide races. Generally, we're looking, I think, at Attorney General, Secretary of State. When we get to Lieutenant Governor, people are wondering, what does the Lieutenant Governor do?
Preside over the Senate.
Preside over the Senate.
Correct.
But tell me of these, let's talk about Attorney General's race. What's at stake besides a Republican or a Democrat in these races?
Well, the Attorney General's office is an extremely important office. It does a lot of litigation that's very important to the criminal and civil justice system of the state. And oftentimes it can be a springboard to other things. Jay Nixon was Attorney General for 4 terms and became a 2-term governor. And although John Ashcroft as well, it's not a perfect springboard. Bill Webster was Attorney General, and I think he went to jail afterward.
Yeah, he had some other issues.
Well, but in this race, what's particularly interesting is that the 2 major candidates have very strong philosophical differences on what the office should be doing. Teresa Hensley, who's the Democrat, who's a former prosecutor, sees it more in line of prosecutions, is pointing out that the Attorney General's office has had to take a lot of cases from counties, rural counties, that they elect theirs and their prosecutors don't know how to handle death penalty cases or other things, and they kick it up to the AG's office. Okay, Hawley says he's fine with that, but he is from the school that sees it more philosophically. He used to be intern in the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. He wants to do more to fight federal regulations like on the EPA, probably the Affordable Care Act maybe. He's very conservative on social issues like abortion. He's very closely tied to some of the conservative groups. So he sees it more as making a case for what Missourians want from the federal government. So he doesn't see that the prosecution role as much, other than he does say he will go after corruption in Jeff City.
And big picture, it kind of makes a difference whether you've got Democrats in those offices or Republicans or a balance. I mean, it seems a balance of power issue as well here.
It can be. Even like Lieutenant Governor, for example, if Russ Carnahan, the Democrat, wins and he presides over a Republican Senate, there is a feeling that the Democrats there may have a better sense of position on advocating for their issues. And also, these offices often do really important things politically. Secretary of State's office writes ballot summaries, and the way that these ballot summaries are written could cause some of these particular provisions to pass or fail.
Great, thanks guys. I appreciate it. I hope we've been helpful. You can get more information about where you vote, what's on the ballot, by going to 9net.org/voters. You still have a little time. And thanks to Joe and Jason from St. Louis Public Radio for helping us make some sense of this. You'll have a busy election night as well.
Yes.
I'm Jim Kirchherr. Good night. Thanks for joining us.